So my name is Michelle Gamble, and I'm a human remains specialist. So full disclosure, I will be talking about all biological remains, but my specialty is human remains. So it might be skewing to that way a little bit more towards the end of the talk. So I thought though that we would start with sort of the basics of what everyone knows of as archaeology. So the first thing I want to sort of talk to you about is what is archaeology? And ultimately, archaeology is a lot of things to a lot of people. So we have the people that study heritage plants, heritage gardens, that's considered archaeology. Working in a lab, looking at various types of materials, whether it be human bones or glass or pottery. We have people doing field surveys, going to visit sites and sort of recording them through photographs or paper records. Excavation within a laboratory, that's a cremation urn that needed excavating within a lab. So we've got that side of it. Survey work, this is a team surveying along Wade's Road. So just doing carte blanche, sort of going across and recording all archaeological monuments. We have map regression surveys where you go through, you can sit and go through the National Map Library of Scotland and look at a particular area and see how it's changed in the maps. There's other recording works on site, such as mapping and digital recording, like you see there. Of course, there's excavation, and aerial surveys are another new one that's sort of become a really big thing in archaeology. But ultimately, archaeology is the study of people in the past and trying to understand their experiences and their lives in the past. So that's what I hope everyone understands. There's no dinosaurs, I'm afraid, as everyone always wants to know about. So the next thing we'll talk about is the type of artifacts and remains you can find. So there's a wide variety of materials that can preserve from the past. So depending on a variety of things, including the environment, the soil conditions, the type of climate in the area, the weather in the area, all these things will impact on the survival of the different types of materials. So this is just like a brief sort of sample of some of the things that preserve. So you've got stone materials, pottery, metal, seeds and plant remains, and human bones, of course, in various states, which I'll talk about, and all sorts of things, glass, metals, all that kind of thing. I'm sure you guys can think of lots yourselves for that. So one of the best ways, though, that we can learn about people in the past is to study their bones and their food remains to understand how they lived and what they ate. And that is ultimately what we're going to talk about here today. So biological remains are things that were once alive and what remains of them for us to study. So for human remains, that can be everything from bones, teeth, mummified tissue, hair and nails, depending again on preservation. So I'm sure you've seen bog bodies from the UK or mummies from the desert. All of these things, there's a wide spectrum there of preservation. We then have animal bones, and again, these will come in various forms. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And plant remains, which include seed, fibers, phytoliths, wood leaves, pollen, that kind of thing. And this can be incorporated into things like clothing and basketry, as well as food remains. So you get a variety of different types of plant remains. So where are these things found in archaeological sites? So the primary place where we'll find human remains is burials, and there's different types of burials. There's cremation burials and inhumation burials. You can see there, that's a variety of burial types. You've got megalithic tombs, you've got simple pit graves, and then monumental tomb structures as well. And the first thing we try to determine when we find a burial is whether it's animal or human. And so I hope everyone can pick out on the screen there which one is the animal and which one is the human. But that's ultimately the first question when you find an articulated skeleton. And articulated means that all the bones are together in the shape of a body, basically. And there's different types of skeletons out there. So on the far left, what you'll see there is an upturned pot. That's a Bronze Age burial from the Isle of Man. That is a cremation burial. So you have to be aware that there's different appearances to different things. You've got cremated bone, inhumations, and they'll be in different levels of preservation. So burials is one of the places we find our biological remains. Another place that is like a very key place for us to find lots and lots and lots of information. And it sounds horrible, but digging up garbage pits. So middens, garbage dumps, and then household sites. So where people leave their waste products. That gives us a really good insight into how they lived. So what you mostly find in these settings is not human bone. You'll mostly find plant remains and animal bones. And animal bones in these settings will typically be quite fragmented and very small, chipped up, because people, when they were eating the bones, will have broken them to get the marrow, they may have boiled them, and you can learn a lot from how they were butchered, what the state of the bone is can actually give you a lot of information. Plant remains will typically survive in a slightly different setting. You do find them in garbage pits and in middens, but more likely you're going to find them in places like hearths and fire pits. And that's because once they've been in those situations, they've been charred and burned, and they preserve a bit better. Because as we know, organic material doesn't tend to preserve very well in soils. It tends to disintegrate, right? Like when you're making compost or doing something like that, that's what happens with most of our materials that we eat and that we have grown. So those are some images there of some seeds up at the top. You've got cremated bone in the middle there, and then some charred seeds as well. So that's sort of a prime place, and that's where you get also, I'm sure you've heard of radiocarbon dating. Often that will come from fire pits as well, because you need something to be charred for you to get a carbon date off it. It has to be turned into a pure carbon. Well, you can get it from bones as well that are not burned, but they have carbon in them inherently because we're all made of carbon. So what can we learn? What can we learn from various things? So from plants and animals, you get a lot about diet. What were people eating? You can also learn a lot about how they were eating them, how they were cooking things. They can tell whether bones, for example, were boiled or not boiled, whether they were roasted or not. When you're looking at plants, you can tell things about medicines, because some plants are not consumable as they are. They need to be treated in a particular way, so then we can learn a little bit about medical treatment as well. We also learn about the climate and the environment from our plant remains. There's something called pore sampling, where you can take samples from the soil and have a look at the different layers to find out what different seeds and soils are available. And in that process, you find out how the climate in the area has changed. So that's just one example of how helpful plants can be in terms of understanding our past environments. As I said, cooking processes, and of course agriculture. Because if a plant is not native to an area and then we find a bunch of seeds or phytoliths from it, that's been brought in, and we can understand whether they were growing it or what was happening, whether people were actively changing their environment, which is quite an interesting thing as well. And we see that a lot in the Neolithic periods, where people start planting and growing their own vegetables, growing their own plants, that sort of thing. So with animal bones, we get an idea a bit more about farming practices as well. We also get an idea of hunting practices, because if we find wild animals within amongst the more domesticated animals, then we can get an idea of that. We can get an idea of domestication in general. So when did the first cow become a domesticated animal? When did it go from wild to domesticate? And that's the same, that is a long process for a lot of animals, and it's something that's widely studied, particularly throughout the Middle East, where a lot of our agricultural practices first started, and where we start to see a lot of domestication taking place. So understanding that, and when you get an idea then of quantities of bone, let's say in a garbage dump, you start to get an idea of, for example, how much meat was a portion of their diet. Like what proportion of a population's diet was meat-based? What proportion of the population's diet was plant-based? And so you can start to really build a picture of how people were living, what they were using, and what sort of resources they had around them. And again, environment, because we know that certain animals can only live in certain environments, and cooking processes, as I said. So I think hopefully I've given you an idea here that there is a lot to be learned from our biological remains. And now I'm going to digress a bit into human remains, as that is my area that I understand best. So human remains are an entirely sort of separate area of bioarchaeology, because from human remains, we can really get a deeper understanding of people's experiences in the past. And there's various ways that we do that. By looking at the skeleton in particular and trying to understand how the person lived, what they might have done, whether they were sick, what they might have suffered from. And then when you take that on an individual level and you extrapolate it and you apply it then to see the population level, that's when you start to see patterns, and that's when you can start to understand perhaps a little bit more about things like changes in migration, changes in population dynamics, hierarchies, social structure, all that kind of thing. So the first thing we always try to sort of learn about is how bones develop, and understanding that when you're born, you have the most bones you will ever have. So the younger people in the audience have more bones than the older people in the audience. And as we grow, our bones fuse together. And this creates our stronger skeleton. So we're a bit bendy when we're younger. And this is something that we can use then to age as one of our age estimation methods. Obviously, once we get to about age 25 and everyone's fully fused skeleton, it becomes a bit harder to age. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we do aging beyond that. The other thing we look for is male and female. So these are our basic biological demographics that we try to get an idea of, because if we can get an idea of the biological groups, then we can get an idea of different community groups within the population. Did females have to do something that males did? Did they have access to different resources than males did? At what age did that happen? Is there a difference? Is there no difference? That kind of thing. So the two main areas of the skeleton that we look at for a sex estimation are the skull and the pelvis. And I think the pelvis is an obvious one because women bear children. Their pelvic structure is very different from a man's pelvic structure. With the skull, it tends to do with muscle attachments and robusticity. If anybody's interested, they can feel on themselves. Things like behind the ear, there's a big bone there called your mastoid, and on men it tends to be bigger. On women it tends to be a little bit less pronounced. The other one is the brow ridge. Everyone likes to feel, you can feel the ear brow ridge. On females, it's quite smooth, and on males, there tends to be a little bump there. So if you wanted to feel your male partner, your female partner, you can test the differences. So that's sort of some of the ways that we then identify certain biological groups. And then I said to you, as I said, estimating age. So one of the ways that we do it, as I said, is bone fusion. And another way that we can do it is teeth development. Both the growing of teeth, so when we grow two sets of teeth in our life. We grow our deciduous teeth or our milk teeth, and then we lose all of those at a certain age, and gradually, obviously. And then we grow our second set of teeth. And when we wear down our teeth, it's a little bit of a sort of questionable area because it does depend on diet a bit. But you can wear down teeth in a fairly regular way, and we can get an age estimation off of that. And we also get age estimations off of degenerative changes that occur at a fairly regular rate, particularly in the pelvis. So age estimation is something, I say it's estimation because obviously in every population there's wide ranges, right? Nobody grows at the same rate exactly. Nobody deteriorates at the same rate exactly. And obviously life and activities have a huge impact on all of that. So we always estimate age. We can get a fairly good determination of sex, but we never really are 100% on age. So whenever you're reading those newspaper articles and they say a 29-year-old female from the Neolithic was found, that's probably more of an estimate than it is anything else, and usually should be given in a range. So in terms of your critical reading, you can start to think, maybe that should be more of an estimated thing rather than a precise thing. So once we've established these like basic biological facts or information, so age and sex, we then try to think about what kind of activities people did and how did they live. And this is obviously just a representation of a prehistoric period, so looking at the kinds of activities people could do. And that changes depending on the time period you're in, the area of the world that you're in. The context of the grave can become important as well. Because, for example, Ian and I were working over in Jedburgh, and we excavated two skeletons there, which you might have heard about. And these people had a series of serious pathologies affecting their skeletons, none of which seemed to be labor-related necessarily. So So there's a good chance that these people had a slightly different set of factors affecting their skeletons. And so this is where you get into things like trying to understand social hierarchy for a time period, where your skeletons fall into that hierarchy, and trying to understand that. So in doing so, what we do is we look at bony changes to the skeleton. So these are just some examples of some changes that you can see. I don't know, I've tried to make them fairly obvious. This is an individual I looked at from Turkey who has poliomyelitis. And you can see that the bones are very different sizes for each side. So the most prominent one is probably the scapulas, the shoulder blades on the bottom right-hand side. You can see that's from the same individual, but there's obviously a big size difference. So part of these things, these bits of data are what we look at to add up to give us a diagnosis of something. And a lot of people ask me, well, what do people die of? And that's something that's actually very, very hard to answer for archaeological material. Unless there's something that's very specific that's affected the skeleton, it's quite hard to tell what someone died of, because most of what kills people is soft tissue issues. So your heart stops. I can't see that on a skeleton. Or your brain doesn't work anymore. We can't see that on a skeleton. So those sorts of things are quite difficult to answer. But what we do look for then is how they lived. So it's a better idea of what they might have lived with. And an important one to look at is the spine. And the spine, because our backs take such abuse because we walk upright, and all the weight of our whole body goes through the spine, it's a really good way to sort of help with aging, help with activity levels, to understand what the person has had to maybe do. And that's quite an interesting part of the body to look at. Other things we can look for are things like surgical intervention. So that's a Roman doctor's surgical kit. And what we might look for is the skeletal evidence of that. So what you have on the left side there is trephination, which is where they have drilled holes in the skull to release pressure, or to release bad spirits, or to release headaches, or whatever they believed at the time would help them. This person, I think if you notice, you can see there's 4 holes there, all of which are healed over, which means this person survived 4 drillings of their skull from a prehistoric period, which is quite an impressive thing, because they didn't have things, they didn't understand, the blood-brain barrier, and that if you went in, they knew people would die if you went into the head, but obviously it's quite hard to calculate that without modern tools and that sort of thing. The picture on the right, which is a bit hard to see, is actually from an 18th century soldier's grave in Vienna, where the person had their foot amputated. So there was a prosthetic that was found, just below there's a picture, there was a prosthetic that was found with that, to where the person had a wooden prosthetic that was then attached. So we can get an idea of what this person's life must have been like, having had a fake leg, a false leg. So all of these aspects of skeletal evidence then provide us with an idea of how the person lived. But to get a better idea of what they ate, we go back to the teeth. And the teeth are a really important part of our skeletal analysis. They help us, as I said, with age, but they can also tell us about what people ate and how they ate. And a lot of that comes from dental calculus, which is a buildup of minerals. So if you don't brush your teeth, you get a buildup of bacteria and minerals on your teeth. And this then mineralizes and becomes hard, becomes a tartar. And that tartar preserves really, really well. And we can take samples of that, and then it can be chemically analyzed to find out whether there's plants in it. They even find meat bits. They find DNA of other bacteria, which gives you an idea of what kind of foods people were eating. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out with that now. And it also can tell us then about how people eat. So when you see there's animal skulls up there as well, because teeth are uniquely designed to suit our diets. So humans, as omnivores, we have grinding teeth at our back, we have tearing teeth with our canines, and we have slicing teeth with our incisors. Animals like cats, for example, don't really have slicing teeth or really grinding teeth. They just have sharp tearing teeth, because the main thing they eat is meat. So depending on what an animal's diet is, you can get an idea of what their what the tooth shape is. You can get an idea of what the animal is, and then also what they ate. So teeth really can tell us quite a bit about diet as well. The other way we can then look at it is we do isotope studies of the teeth. And how we do that is you take a tooth and you analyze it for its stable isotope components of carbon and nitrogen. And this is just an example here to show you the different sort of ways that they're grouped together. So this is just an example board. This isn't a specific set of samples that we looked at or anything. But what it can do is tell you whether someone had a more terrestrial-based diet, so like a meat-based diet or a plant-based diet, or whether there was a more marine-based diet. And that comes again from the teeth. So depending on which tooth they use, they can then tell whether it's from which part of your life it's from. So if it's a tooth that develops at a later stage, so like your back molars, your wisdom teeth, then that's obviously later in your life. And the same thing is if you compare it then to a bone sample, because you can do stable isotope analysis on that, you get the last 10 years of someone's life in their bones. So bones constantly renew. You never have the same, your bones are always regenerating themselves. This is the best part about bones. You can break it and it heals itself, right? So bones are always growing new cells to keep you going. And in doing so, that means that the foods that you're eating are going to be represented in the bones for the last 10 to 15 years roughly. So you really are what you eat. And it can show up in your skeleton, whether it be from your teeth to show sort of your earlier diets, your bones for your later diet. That doesn't mean we can tell, like if you had pizza 6 times a week, we're not going to be able to identify that. But obviously we'd be able to identify what types of diets you're eating. Now this, I should qualify this and say this is getting much more complicated as we now are populations that move around and we no longer are eating, say, just food from our local areas. So we're getting a much more complicated isotope environment, like scale, because people are not sort of, I think that archaeologists of the future are going to struggle with our skeletons because obviously if I get buried here, I was not born in this country and I've only lived here the last 15 years. So it's one of these things where there's going to be huge variations. But for now, as long as we're studying people in the past, we're pretty good because up until the mid-19th century, people were not moving around as much. And there wasn't sort of foreign produce coming in huge amounts that would then throw off the isotopes that we're studying. So just to summarize then, biological remains. So that's all the things that have been living in the past and that we are now able to identify. So we've used animal and plant remains found in household and living contexts to discuss aspects of diet, farming practices, herding and culling, hunting, and also then life ways of people, so how they were living in these processes. And human remains, which are primarily found in burial contexts, can provide a wide range of data for understanding the life ways, diet, mobility, health, and disease in the past. So that's sort of the summary of it. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, I should also say I'd like to thank the Heritage Lottery Fund and Philago Trust for funding all of sort of us being here and all the work that's been done at Hume. But yeah, that's kind of, but yeah. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know, and yeah, just shoot, I'm here. Yeah, if you don't, that's fine too. Yeah, thank you for coming. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? Are you guys happy? Okay, good. Okay, sorry, did you want?
So just an observation, when I was a child, we lived next to a farm.
Yeah.
And one year the farmer and the nearest fields was normal. But I think he used human waste at that time.
Okay.
And not long after that, the field was full of tomato plants.
Oh, okay.
And obviously it was the seeds that had gone through.
Started
to grow.
Oh my
gosh.
Yeah. How strange is that? I mean, there you go. The digestive tract doesn't get it
So
all.
I'm just sort of linking that with middens. And if you
Yeah,
turn the soil over, what seeds would grow would be what that's thrown away.
definitely. Yeah. No, it's definitely. And I mean, I didn't even get into things like coprolites and studying fecal matter and stuff like that. There's a lot of that. And then there's now a study where they're looking at what modern plants that they see growing. So they've done some studies, one study I should say that I've read about. So they have these places called body farms where they learn about how bodies disintegrate in different environments, and they try to understand a little bit more about how after death, the skeleton changes. And so they've now identified plants that typically grow over burials. So this is mostly to be used in forensics cases where they're looking for a body. If they see a particular type of plant now, they're saying there's a good indication that there's a skeleton under there. There's a human burial under there, which I find amazing. We have one of our students that comes out on our field school where we do survey up in the Highlands. She's actually a plant specialist, and when we're walking through these abandoned 19th century villages, she's going, oh, that plant there, that's not native to this area. That was brought in. It looks like it's been there for a while, so it's like clearly something that soldiers brought in, or like they brought in, thyme from blah blah blah, and this from there, and this one. And she just walks along and she can identify all these plants. So there's a huge number of ways to sort of interact with the past and how people lived and what they did. I think it's really interesting. So, yeah.
I was reading as well that after death, the colour comes out of the hair, everybody's hair turns red.
Oh, okay.
Is that true?
I'm not sure about that.
Oh,
I honestly don't know the right answer to that question, but I have seen hair of different colors. So my guess is it really depends on the soil conditions and the environment that the skeleton or the burial is in. Because hair most often doesn't survive in most places, but like for example, I've seen black hair on bog bodies and stuff like that. So I would think that might not be totally accurate. There you go. Well, thank you again for coming. I'm here all day. So as cliched as that sounds, but yeah. So feel free. I mean, I know most of you have had a look around the exhibition now, but if you want to look again or you want to ask any questions, I'll be here, and I'm happy to talk bones or plants with anyone. But yeah, thanks again.